Warriors of the Infinite, welcome to Chapter 16 of REN-SHEN Half Spirit, the Three Deathbringers. The old man led Steve outside for the first time in well over a month. Steve normally didn't have enough energy to walk to the toilet and relieve himself, yet, surprisingly, the old man's barely discernible touch on his back lightened Steve's physical burden. He left behind the den of depravity without even turning to look at it. Steve had to hold his trousers up as he walked. His emaciated body had only craved the dragon's narcotic during his time at the sinful sanctuary. Food was not even a thought the entire time he was there. It was relegated to a barely essential second place in comparison to the exquisitely intoxicating vapour which had allowed him to escape the misery of his plight. They entered a car waiting outside as the old man spoke in a comment. The old man sat in the back seat with Steve and was examining him carefully. Steve was struggling to sit silently as he shivered and occasionally moaned. The withdrawals had set in. He craved his drug, and his mother witch was gone. Steve was perplexed with his own actions. He somehow intuitively followed this man without question. Perhaps because he was unblemished. Not burdened or influenced, the man was impeccably free of demons. Since the sword pierced his chest and soul, Steve could see the demons on every adult as plainly as the clothes they were wearing. The different colour eyes seemed to correlate with the personalities of the people. But he never really gave that observation the attention it properly deserved. His priority was the mother's evil milk the hag provided to him. As the vapour entered his lungs, his ability to see the demons vanished, and so did the reminders of Kumicho and every other miserable memory. While Steve was not under the wicked influence of the opium, he saw demons on everyone as he left the hag's establishment. Yet the old man was free of the demonic afflictions. Steve looked down at his feet and saw a couple of small demons still clinging to him as he tried to fling them off his feet. He was shivering, notwithstanding the evening's warmth, and becoming extremely self-conscious in the presence of the curious little old man. The old man smiled and brushed Steve's feet as though he was flicking off some dust. The demons evaporated into steam and were quickly vacuumed out of the open car window. Steve looked at the old man incredulously and asked, "You can see them?" The old man just laughed and continued to examine Steve. Steve tried to sleep in the car, but his addiction was making it impossible for him. His body was only tenuously under his control as the shakes continued to broadcast his accursed addiction. The constant movement of the car was only amplifying his nausea. Every time he opened an eye to see what the old man was doing, he would see him looking at him with an unabating and curious smile. They drove all night, and by dawn they reached the base of a mountain range. A sign indicating they were at the base of the Wu Yi Mountains meant little to Steve, but it was a prompt for the driver to stop and open the rear door for the old man. The old man gestured for Steve to get out of the car. Steve had been sitting in the same position too long. He was unable to move from his sweat-drenched position in the back seat. The old man's smile transformed into a look of exasperation. He reached in the car and grabbed Steve's wrist. Steve tried to move, but the old man just pointed at him like he was telling a dog to sit. The old man breathed deeply and his eyes became white as a white glow began to radiate from where he was holding Steve's wrist. Steve felt a vibration through his wrist and then through the rest of his body. He looked at his wrist and saw black sweat emanating from the pores of his skin. He then noticed the sticky black sweat over his entire body as it soaked into the fabric of his filthy clothing. The old man's eyes returned to normal and he pulled his hand away and said something to Steve in Putonghua and pointed up at the mountains. Steve took a deep breath and readied himself to get out of the car again, but something was very different. His tremors had disappeared. He was breathing easier, and there was a lightness to his body that he had never experienced before. His renewed energy belied his emaciated look as he sprang out of the car and stood next to the old man. The old man promptly ventured off the road into the dense green foliage of the mountains, with Steve following quickly behind him. The old man was inconceivably fast and deliberate in his movements as they ascended the mountains together. Winding up the mountains, they reached a beautifully farmed tea plantation on a gently sloping hill. A solitary, small cabin was situated on the other side of the plantation, and the old man yelled a greeting as he neared it. A young girl, also unblemished, soon came outside with tea for the old man and Steve. She was wearing a green headscarf underneath a hat, and it seemed odd to Steve that such a young person looked to be living alone in the mountains. Steve understood little of the discussions between the old man and the young girl. The old man was pointing at the plantation and the clouds, and it seemed he was talking about the weather. The girl looked to be no older than 15 and spoke quietly with the old man. She occasionally looked over at Steve, who was still processing the healing energy he received from the old man. Steve paid the girl little attention, but noticed she had extraordinary eyes of green. He had never seen an Asian person displaying such a genetic trait and was somewhat surprised a teenager was still free of demons. Some girls working at the brothel were not much older than her in his estimations and were already teeming with demons. The girl filled Steve's teacup and gestured for him to drink. The old man seemed to be talking about the tea as he raised his cup and insisted Steve drink with him. Steve found the taste rather peculiar, but found it unexpectedly invigorating. In fact, he found the environment very uplifting and a welcome change from his solitary confinement of only a few hours earlier. The old man thanked the young girl and recommenced his journey with Steve. The climate was changing as they ascended the mountains, and the humid environment at the base soon developed into a cold bite. They passed many dilapidated temples on the ascent, and Steve saw some ruined lion statues which looked similar to the Shisa in Okinawa. Steve had the distinct feeling the old man would not be surprised in the least if Steve was to demonstrate any supernatural ability. The old man was moving at an impossibly fast pace, and had already shown he was far from normal when he cured Steve from his addiction pains with his healing touch. They crossed rivers and passed spectacular waterfalls and finally reached a cave adjacent to a waterfall. The cave led to a deeper cave which they traversed until reaching a statue of a fierce warrior, similar in looks to the Neo he saw in Kyoto almost a year earlier. The old man held his hands in a prayer position and faced the statue. He looked at Steve, and it was clear from his motions he wanted Steve to do the same. Steve held his hands in a praying position and faced the statue. His mind was wandering. He was thinking about Megumi and their precious baby, lost. The old man clapped his hands and caught Steve's attention. He pointed to the statue and insisted on more devotion from Steve. Steve focused on the statue and recalled Temyana's instructions about Bodhidharma and Alexander's journeys. It occurred to Steve that many of these statues existed because of the influence of his very own bloodline. Steve felt a connection to the statue and was compelled to touch it. He reached out and touched the raised arm of the fierce warrior statue, and the flame etchings around the statue set alight. A ring of fire surrounded the statue, and the warrior moved from its fearsome fighting stance and turned to its side. It revealed a new exit from the cave. The old man looked extremely pleased. He and Steve walked through the exit, and the grandeur of the mountains revealed themselves in all their glory. They were on a lush green plateau the size of 10 football fields overlooking rivers and clouds. Adjacent to the plateau was an immaculate small forest. The trees of the forest were perfectly straight and in precise formation. They looked like a 1,000-strong army at attention. Steve took a deep breath and embraced the incredible landscape. It was a very long journey, and the sun was setting over the mountains. The old man led Steve to a small temple. Its singularly most unique feature was the fact that it was not in a state of complete ruin and was well preserved, unlike all of the others he had seen on his ascent. He showed Steve inside a small room to the side of the temple and left a robe and trousers for him to change into. Steve was left alone and watched through the window as the old man went to a nearby cave. Steve sat on the bed, and within moments the day had caught up with him. He was exhausted and fell asleep immediately. He entered into an extraordinarily vivid dream, unlike any before that evening. In his dream, he saw his lion energy in the distance, and closer to him passed a monk in orange robes. The monk turned and looked at Steve. He then positioned himself into what looked like a kata or fighting stance, and moved his hands in fighting motions at a blinding pace, circular and powerful. He stopped, and then had 18 arms attached to his torso. He then walked towards the lion, and they acknowledged each other in a formal yet familiar fashion. The monk with his numerous arms saluted, and the lion bowed. Steve felt his body shaking and wondered how the dream had affected him so physically. But to his mild disappointment, it was the old man waking him up. He slept all night and enjoyed the distraction of his curious dream. But the old man clearly had an agenda for him as he threw the clothing he left for Steve at him. Steve changed out of his filthy clothes in front of the old man. He was self-conscious of his emaciated body, and the old man didn't help by staring at Steve and inspecting his body. Steve pulled the hood of his robe over his head, wishing it could have covered more of him. The old man held Steve's arm and tapped the inside of his wrist while looking deeply into Steve's eyes. He made Steve poke his tongue out and then nodded his head whilst conversing with himself. The old man left the room and returned a few minutes later with a cup of tea. Steve wasn't expecting this man to be his personal attendant, yet he was appreciative of the hot tea. He tried to convey that sentiment with gestures, but the old man just encouraged him to drink his tea. Unfortunately, it tasted nothing like the refreshing tea they drank at the tea plantation with the girl with green eyes. It was absolutely vile, and he couldn't keep the first sip down. The old man insisted he drink it all while Steve coughed and spluttered as he attempted to finish the putrid substance. Steve assumed something so disgusting would have to be medicinal and persisted with the foul liquid. He remembered the last time he thought he was taking medicine and it descended him into an addicted hell. But this man was so different. All of Steve's instincts indicated there was a cocoon of safety associated with this little old man. They went outside and walked across the beautiful green field until the view took Steve's breath away. They were high in the mountains overlooking a powerful river, and some of the white water spray reached him and tickled his nose and invigorated his senses. The old man assumed a meditating stance and motioned to Steve to do the same. It was a low horse-riding stance with his hands placed forward in a prayer position, with the top of his thumbs level with his nose. It was substantially lower than his typical Goju-Ryu stance, and Steve's legs soon began to shake uncontrollably. He thought to himself, I don't think I could have done this easily when I was strong, much less now. Steve could sense the old man's placidity and soothing energy and eventually found a position for himself which optimized his body geometry such that his legs weren't screaming for mercy. They remained in their meditative stances for hours, and Steve's mind wandered with the inspiration of the bird whistles and water sprays. He allowed the surrounding nature into his mind and connected with the mountains. The location of the sun suggested it was midday when Steve heard footsteps behind him. They were light, yet purposeful. He heard the gentle voice of the girl with green eyes as she delicately interrupted the old man's meditation. The old man laughed as he sprung up from his horse stance and instructed Steve to follow him. Steve was quite sure his legs were dead. He wasn't able to spring up from his position, but he managed to straighten his legs eventually. He followed the old man and girl back to the temple, walking like an old cowboy. The girl had made some more of her glorious tea. The smell was familiar enough to confirm he was not going to have to endure that vile drink he consumed earlier in the morning. Steve thought it must have been close to lunchtime, and he was a little surprised to only have tea. His body wasn't particularly screaming for food, and he thought to himself, beggars can't be choosers, as he drank a few cups of the hot, refreshing tea. Surprisingly, the tea managed to completely extinguish Steve's faint desire for food. He was concerned about his body. He'd lost so much muscularity since he was confined to his shameful and bitter addiction in the dark room of despair. Food would help him rebuild his strength, and he wondered when they might eat something. Nourishment for his body was a valid concern, but Steve also gained a small insight into the state of his mind during the morning's meditation. He was not well. His mind wandered back to dark places, and his spirit became paralyzed when trying to address them. He quickly learned his mind needed nourishment just as much, or quite possibly even more, than his body. Steve understood very little of the conversation between the old man and the girl. He picked up a few words, but wasn't able to discern anything meaningful. He found the relationship between the two of them to be somewhat peculiar. She paid him infinite respect, and the old man was equally respectful to the young girl. In Japan, Steve would notice how older men received respect from younger people, and often were quite dismissive to children and teenagers. Steve guessed they may well be the only two people on the mountain and had to learn to live well with each other. It was pleasing to see what looked to be a wholesome and mutually rewarding and respectful relationship between the old man and the young girl. After the tea break and some more conversation between the old man and girl, Steve and the old man returned to the location where they meditated in the morning. The old man made Steve assume the horse stance and then corrected his posture and hand position. He then left Steve alone in his own thoughts as he returned to the temple. Steve thought about everything and nothing whilst in his meditative stance. It occurred to him that he used some of his own powers to open the cave when he touched the statue. How did the young girl manage to pass through to us here? He thought to himself. It may have been minutes or hours when the old man returned. He was carrying a tiny black piglet and immediately proffered it to Steve. Steve thought perhaps the piglet was going to be dinner and he had no idea how to prepare food whatsoever. Further, who's going to eat this cute little pig? He thought to himself as he rose out of his horse stance and smiled at the piglet. The old man raised his voice and seemed to scold Steve as he instructed Steve to return to his horse stance. Steve's praying hands were now holding the piglet, and soon enough, neither Steve nor the piglet seemed particularly pleased about the arrangement. The piglet weighed almost nothing, but Steve quickly learned that almost nothing could mean something quite different from nothing after enduring the process for hours. It was dusk when the old man returned, and the piglet seemed as relieved as Steve to see him. They returned back to the temple with the piglet following them. The old man showed Steve where some grains and other items were stored and showed how to feed the piglet. The piglet was tiny and still on its mother's milk. When Steve saw the size of the mother pig, he couldn't reconcile how such a tiny creature could grow so big. It was surely over 150 kilograms. Steve and the old man returned to the temple and sat together. Steve resolved it would be a quiet, contemplative evening as he copied the old man's sitting position and crossed his legs. The old man spoke in Putonghua, and Steve gave the universal shrug to indicate he did not understand again. But the old man continued to speak in his little understood language as he stood up and walked towards Steve. He raised his hand and his eyes turned white, and a white beam of energy enveloped Steve. The old man returned to his seated position and continued speaking. Steve had been latching on to the few words he understood from little Nan was teaching him. But to his surprise, he managed to latch on to every word the old man was saying. The old man said, "I've been very interested in you since you came to me in my dreams in recent times." Steve's astonishment interfered with his ability to speak for a moment until he gathered his thoughts. He wasn't even sure what language he was using to respond with when he said, "I can't believe I can understand you. Thank you for saving me from this terrible existence back in Xiamen. And thank you for curing my addiction. I don't know how you did it, but I'm grateful. I'm Steve Nedelkin. May I ask your name, sir?" The old man replied, "You freely made the decision to leave that place in Xiamen. This was not foretold. You may have been Steve Nedelkin once, but we are both yet to learn your real name now." "I have many names. You can call me Si Ming. Tell me about your dreams last night. It is important I know who visited you." Steve said, I dreamed of an 18-armed monk warrior. He stood before me and..." Si Ming interrupted and said, "Good. I thought so. You are a warrior after all. And what did the spirit of Lohan do with your lion spirit when they met?" Steve never mentioned his lion energy, nor did he assume the 18-armed monk was Lohan's spirit. He had heard Lohan mentioned many times with both of his sensei. He stuttered and said, "They bowed to each other." Si Ming said, "Of course they bowed. They're not animals. I need to know how they bowed. Tell me how you felt about their greeting." Steve was perplexed with the man's knowledge and said, "Wait, how did you find me?" "Well, they looked like they knew each other. They had met before and it seemed as though they bowed as equals." "Aha," said Si Ming. "Yes, that is very interesting. You are unique in all my assessments. I will say I have never come across anything precisely like you before. You must understand your dreams can reveal more about your present state of existence than mortal life for you now. You must study them carefully and learn from them. You will have many visitations. In fact, I was foretold about you in one of my dreams. The woman in the half mask was very insistent. She would have been formidable in her full form in this world." "Temyana!" Steve exclaimed. He found unexpected comfort that at least some things from his past continued to exist in such a tenuously tangible way. He was also infinitely relieved to be in a situation where dialogue was possible with Si Ming. The man was impossibly deep and timeless with his insights. Just a look from him seemed to convey the thoughts of a million wise men. He knew things about Steve intuitively, and the dream connection to Temyana was further affirmation of the positivity of their coming together. Steve asked Ximing if he was a Shaolin Kung Fu master. Ximing laughed and said, "Perhaps you missed the sign at the front of this temple. You are in the home of the great Five Ancestors of Shaolin. This temple is the great Southern Shaolin temple. No human will readily find it, and it remains a myth to all but the truest of warriors. In a way, you can describe me as a Shaolin master. But a better way to describe is to say the spirits of the Five Ancestors are deeply connected to me here, in this spiritual sanctuary. If your first dream here is any indication, you will also be connected to them. We will have much to discuss, but you should sleep now. You have much to learn in your sleep." Steve retired to his room and lay on his bed and closed his eyes. He quickly fell asleep and found himself walking in an ancient Chinese city. He entered inside a grand palace and his lion spirit was in the distance. He roamed the palace and marveled at the beauty of the exquisite furniture and paintings and vases. He walked into the throne room and an emperor was sitting on his throne. He was wearing the finest silks and playing with his moustache when he noticed Steve's intrusion. He stood up from his throne and cast off his robes. His thick and muscular body was somewhat surprising for an emperor surrounded by such delicate elegance. He stood before Steve, and in contrast to the circular whirlwind of the 18 hands Lohan, the emperor proceeded to demonstrate his movements. His hands looked like knives as they cut through the air. They were linear, penetrating and decisive, and his stance was low and powerful. He finished his fearsome display of martial efficiency and walked towards Steve's lion spirit. They were also familiar with each other as they saluted each other. Steve awoke, determined to remember every part of the dream. Ximing was sitting in the corner of Steve's room. He was eager to learn about Steve's dream. "Who did you meet this time?" he said as he handed Steve the disgusting tea he gave him the day earlier. Steve declined the tea, but Ximing insisted Steve drink the tea. "You are drinking this medicine to rebalance your mortal afflictions. This is not negotiable if you want to exist as a mortal in this world. Now tell me everything about your dream encounter." Steve reluctantly drank the tea and proceeded to describe his encounter to Ximing. Ximing said, "The great Emperor Taizu, excellent. He also knew your lion spirit. I'm yet to understand your connection to them. Something about you intrigues me. Now you must meditate. Go and get your pig." The little black piglet looked happy to see him, but the prospect of holding the cute little creature for hours didn't particularly thrill Steve. In any case, he was absolutely sure that everything had a purpose with Ximing's instructions. He commenced his morning meditation while holding the piglet and was soon bathing in his own perspiration. He could have sworn the pig had put on weight since the day before. The hours passed and the light but purposeful footsteps behind him heralded some reprieve. It was time for the glorious tea with the master and the green-eyed girl. Finally, Steve was able to understand them. He guessed they were talking about the weather when he couldn't understand them. In fact, he was less sure about what they were discussing, even though he could understand them. Ximing mentioned a dark cloud from Beijing and a Zhao something or someone and a sword of Taizu. For the first time, Steve noticed a look of concern on the master's face. Again, Steve was surprised with the weight Ximing gave to the answers from the young green-eyed girl. The old man seemed to have such deep knowledge of all things, yet paid great heed to the little girl's answers, which were even more confusing than the master's observations. Steve was grateful to return the piglet to its pen so he could continue his meditation in the afternoon alone. The tea was more than refreshing. It seemed to connect Steve to the mountains. He was comforted by the rushing rivers and the crisp mountain air as he meditated on the calming green plateau. He imagined his son and wondered who was looking after him, how safe he was, and what he looked like. The hours passed and Ximing arrived to call Steve back to the temple. They drank some more of the green-eyed girl's tea and Steve had many questions. Steve said, "Ximing, I am embarrassed to call you by your name. If you do not mind, I would prefer to address you more respectfully as Sifu. I hope that is acceptable to you." Ximing smiled and said, "I have many names. Some call me the Director of Destinies, Master of Fate, Lord of the Mountains. Some even call me the Big Man. But I prefer Sifu today. Yes, that is perfectly acceptable." The answer from Si-Ming gave Steve even more questions, but he needed answers to more pressing matters. He explained the events which led him to the dark den. He didn't miss anything. He explained his experience with Kumicho and how the sword from his own bloodline pierced his chest. Even his celestial journey didn't faze Si-Ming in the slightest, and the only issue which seemed to raise his interest was the sword which stabbed him in the chest. So the sword from your own bloodline made you this way? It has magic I do not understand, but I certainly know what it did to you. It killed your 3 Deathbringers, which reside in every human's body. They dictate how long a man lives. You were meant to die at precisely that time, but instead, the sword killed the 3 Deathbringers, and because of the magic in the sword, you remain in this world as a transcendent and immortal. Steve was bewildered and asked, "Are you saying I cannot die?" Si-Ming said, "There are much worse things than death. Imagine an eternity under the control of an all-powerful evil demon spirit. You are neither alive or dead. Your only release will be to submit to the demon fully and become one yourself. You told me they called you Ishiganto in Okinawa. They received the name from a great man who conquered evil here in China. He was called Shi Dangdang here. You were able to do this in your full human form, which is remarkable in itself. But I do not know your name now. You appear to be neither human nor a god. Your purpose is best described as yet to be determined, and I will call you warrior. It is time for you to learn in your sleep. Go now and remember everything." Steve retired to his room. He didn't know how to interpret the information from Si-Ming. It was not expected information, nor was it anything which could be described as a human condition. It was simply too much to deal with. The notion of immortality seemed like a childhood fantasy, yet the reality was daunting. He wondered what he lost or would continue to lose of his humanity. He thought about his newborn son and what purpose or function he could possibly have in his child's life. He thought about the evening when his beautiful wife and his life were taken away from him. Si-Ming and Temyana, even Baba Radha, spoke about destinies to him, yet he was lost and not even able to understand who or what he was. He missed his wife. His confusion and deep sadness were his only companions as he eventually faded into a sleep. Steve's dream found himself walking near a lake. His lion spirit was inexplicably walking on the water. A majestic white crane flew from the water next to Steve and changed into a young woman. The woman charged at Steve in an attacking manner, and Steve tried to push her away. Her defensive arm changed back into the crane's wing, and she used her wing to block Steve's arm as she evaded his push. The woman smiled and then saluted Steve. She reverted back into the white crane and flew to the lake, whereupon the lion spirit and white crane greeted each other in familiar fashion. The white crane then launched into the sky and flew off into the sunset. The following morning, Si-Ming expressed surprise that the white crane feigned an attack on Steve. The smile and the greeting to the lion spirit were significant to him. "It seems you might be ready for instruction soon," he said. Steve drank more of the terrible medicine in the morning and went to his morning meditation with the piglet, whom he had named Pig. Pig had seemed to accept his role in Steve's morning meditation. He would sleep while Steve's mind wandered beyond his physical location. He watched his timeline unfold and dissected traumatic moments in his life in endless loops. He kept searching for better answers in his mind and was surprised the entire morning had already disappeared when Si-Ming and the green-eyed girl called him to tea. Steve was increasingly curious about the interactions between Si-Ming and the green-eyed girl. It appeared she was his source of news, and he placed great importance on her observations. She spoke of someone called Zhao Duyi, and Si-Ming immediately insisted on every detail. Zhao Duyi was moving up the ranks of the Chinese Communist Party and had recently become the director of a provincial commission for national defense mobilization. The national newspaper was talking about his meteoric rise and the prospects of him becoming the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the People's Liberation Army. "This demon will rule the celestial empire if he continues unabated. I cannot believe I didn't see his intentions. You were so little and yet you warned me," said Si-Ming. The girl just nodded as she topped up Steve and Si-Ming's teacups. Steve still didn't know the girl's name. He told her how much he enjoyed her lovely tea and introduced himself. The green-eyed girl responded, "I am Ling. You are welcome." Steve was still perplexed with the relationship between Si-Ming and Ling. It was obvious she was intelligent beyond her years. She had a quiet confidence which belied her youthful years, and Steve wondered if Si-Ming had been instructed her in any way similar to him. It was time for afternoon meditation, and Steve was becoming more accustomed to letting his mind roam freely and allowing himself to truly relax. He was finding ways to process his grief and realized how fruitless the time he spent in the opium-induced stupor was for him. He could feel the mountain's energy and immersed himself deeply into his own consciousness. He had entered into a dreamlike trance and found himself in the nearby little forest. It was noisy, the wind was blowing through the trees, and he was acutely aware of every insect and creature in the forest. Through the perfectly aligned trees, he could see his lion spirit on the field. He then heard a shriek from above as a golden monkey jumped from the trees and stood in front of Steve. The monkey picked up a rock and threw it at Steve. He could feel the sting of where the rock hit his forehead, even in his meditative stance. The monkey then jumped at Steve, and he quickly blocked a fist the monkey was aiming at his head. Monkey let his arm collapse around Steve's block and then hit Steve with its elbow. Steve went to strike the monkey, but it hooked its hand around Steve's arm and twisted him off balance. By the time Steve found his balance, he looked up and the golden monkey had transformed into a monk who saluted Steve. The monk walked onto the field and called out to the lion spirit. They both looked pleased to see each other and proceeded to bow to each other. As the lion spirit lowered its head, the monk transformed again into the golden monkey and jumped on top of the lion spirit, shrieking in laughter. The lion spirit shook its head and monkey fell on the ground laughing. They both seemed to find the interaction amusing, and Steve arose from his meditation with a chuckle. Steve told Si-Ming about the events of his afternoon meditation, and Si-Ming was astounded. He said, "Golden monkey couldn't wait for your dreams. He found you in your meditation. Remarkable. And he was joking with your lion spirit?" "Monkey will never follow protocol." Si-Ming was very impressed with the visit from the golden monkey in Steve's meditation. "Soon you might be able to see them in your waking hours. But you still have one more to meet," he said. Steve retired to his bed and recalled the events of the last few days. His dreams were significant and the visitations were positively palpable. There was much to learn in his dream and meditative states. He practiced his deep nasal breathing and eased into his sleep, determined to open his mind to any visitations. His dreams were upon him as he saw his lion spirit in the distance. He was not on the mountain. He was back in Okinawa. It was Kumicho's castle grounds where his lion spirit was pouncing on imaginary targets. Steve was walking to the castle entrance, and next to him was a monk of similar height to his own. He was a barrel-chested man, perhaps a little overweight, but in no way unhindered by his paunch. His movements were effortless as he glided alongside Steve. From the top of his head radiated a bright orange energy, and it contrasted greatly with the brightest blue eyes he had ever seen. The monk walked straight into the castle and headed straight for the display cabinet with the sword that pierced Steve's chest. Steve watched as the monk retrieved the sword and held it in the air. The castle shook and turned to dust around them as they found themselves back on the mountain near the temple. The monk threw the sword at Steve's feet and then stood in a standing meditation position. Steve synchronized his breathing with the monk, and they meditated together for the entire night. The monk arose from his meditation and walked towards the lion spirit. Even in Steve's sleep, he was paying particular attention to the expected salute and watched every minute detail of the interaction. However, the monk did not salute the lion spirit at all. As he reached closer to the lion, he gained pace and then ran full speed at it. When the two finally met, there was no impact at all. The monk merged with the lion spirit, and the lion expanded into a larger version of itself. The lion spirit then charged at Steve until it was right next to him. Steve felt compelled to touch the lion as he had done once before in one of his poisoned dreams of the opium pit. But this time the response was indeed different. Instead of collapsing into the horde of warrior ancestors, his hands seemed to merge with the energy. He became one with the lion spirit as he walked completely into it. He was himself, yet he was linked to the energy in a way that was automatically obvious and natural to him, yet completely unknown to him before that moment. He awoke feeling energized. Si-Ming was eager to learn of the dream. He was elated with the information and interpreted it for Steve. He explained, "This was your most powerful dream. It confirms what I have already seen yet could not fathom. It confirms what you are but cannot see. Your own bloodline, Bodhidharma, the spiritual ancestor of all the Shaolin great ancestors, has reached you. He led you to your lion spirit, and the power of one of the greatest bloodlines resides in you and deems you worthy. He threw his own sword at your feet. The sword is important to you. You must retrieve it. You have now met all of the Shaolin Five Ancestors, and your own bloodline is the one who the other four look up to for spiritual guidance. The four are obligated to you as you are to the five. Your path is singular. Steve was processing Si-Ming's interpretation of his dream. His anxiety increased tenfold when he was reminded of the sword. In order to retrieve it, he knew he would need to be ready for combat with Kumicho. A confused combination of resolve and fear in relation to the sword and Kumicho began to wrestle in Steve's mind. The intense emotion of what the evil monster had taken away from him lingered in his mind and influenced his every action. Not only did he lose everything he loved, but his own connection to humanity was also lost because of him. The thought of battling Kumicho gave Steve a genuine sense of dread as he recalled the ferocity of Kumicho in his full demon form. Steve understood he needed to learn much more about himself before he could consider confronting Kumicho again. Well, that, my friends, was chapter 16, The Three Deathbringers. Si-Ming, this little old man who had these clearly some magical ability. He was traveling through the Wu Yi mountains there. He managed to make Steve feel pretty damn good, even though he was addicted to the opium and had a whole bunch of issues there with withdrawal symptoms and whatnot. So just instantly made him better. So that was pretty cool. They got to the Wu Yi mountains. These mountains are famous for so many things in China. They're in the Fujian province, not too far away from Xiamen, you know, a few hours away. It's all in the same province. The Wu Yi mountains are just famous for being, you know, it's a Taoist mecca in a sense. The birthplace of black tea and oolong tea. Some of the most expensive teas come from this region, expensive teas in the world. And in fact, under Taoist sort of beliefs, you've got this person, this god called Si-Ming, known as the director of destinies. And he talked about the three Deathbringers and how our Steve had his Deathbringers destroyed through the magic of the sword. Now, the Deathbringers, there's one up high, one in the middle, and one down below. And one of those three things is going to kill you. And Si-Ming, in fact, there is a day in the year that, particularly for the Chinese who believe this, they refuse to go to sleep on that particular night because that's the night Si-Ming comes to visit. So feel free to look him up. He comes to visit and he knows then when to come back for you during the next 12 months because that's when he knows who's going to die. So a lot of Chinese refuse to go to sleep on that night. So they stay awake the entire time because you don't want Si-Ming to come visiting. So otherwise he'll be informed, he'll know when to come back for you. So Si-Ming's not fake, he's a real person in some belief systems. Some religious belief systems. And here he is looking out for our dear friend Steve Nedelkin, or whatever his name is now, yet to be determined. Warrior was his name. He met that young girl. Don't even know how she's there. She seems to be able to get through into the spiritual sanctuary. She makes this tea that seems to be really tasty and goes down like a treat. So everyone's pretty pleased with that. Si-Ming seems to enjoy her company, and Steve certainly enjoys drinking the tea. Further to that, what have we got? Let's see, we started meditating. Well, first of all, he had to get into the spiritual sanctuary, and Steve seemed to have passed some test. That warrior lit up, the one who was defending the entrance to the mystical area. The Wu Yi mountains are very interesting from a Taoist perspective. They do have immortals that they talk about. If you search for immortals and Wu Yi mountain, there is a lot of mystical and spiritual stuff going on, and some of it's tied in with the Shaolin history as well. So I felt like I had no choice but to use the Wu Yi mountains in this storyline. So you know, I think there's they found people buried in canoes in amongst the mountains in caves. So these are canoes that, obviously we're going to ship them through, the next world or something like that, and float them into the next world. There's some very weird stuff and some incredible history for that in that region. So by all means, look that up. It's great fun. And then we get, my dear friends, to my favourite part. Is it my favourite? Well, it's a part that's dear to my heart because I've been teaching Shaolin, Five Ancestors, Kung Fu for over 30 years. I still teach it. It's a big part of my life, and I wanted to honour my style with a nod to the history of the style. And here was Steve getting exposed to the Five Ancestors, the great Five Ancestors of Shaolin. If you talk about it in Chinese, you'll have to excuse my pronunciation, but it's Wu Zu Chun, which is Five Ancestors style or fist, or something like that. And it is a southern Chinese, southern Shaolin style, which is made up of 5 different styles. And these were all related to the great Five Ancestors. And the first ancestor that he met was Lohan, or they call it 18 hands Arhat, particular circular movements. They're very much related to that particular style. Very circular, very cyclonic, a lot of twisting and explosive forces. And then Steve came across Emperor Tai Tzu, and that's the Grand Emperor. So that's a particularly long-reaching knife, sort of piercing style where the hands are just spearing forwards. And then White Crane, the girl whose hands transformed into wings during one of his meditative moments there. That's quite interesting because this was a girl who watched these cranes in battle with each other, and she saw how they used their wings, and then all of a sudden she kind of developed this entire style based on that wing movement. So White Crane is a big part of Five Ancestors style Kung Fu. And then the Golden Monkey, monkey style, or the Traveller, is another aspect of Shaolin Five Ancestors, which is very evasive and very flexible and very resourceful. The monkey is considered a very clever creature, and I think we all accept that. We can see the way they move, and they're so strong, So you're not bound by watching, Vin Diesel movies or something, or who pick the modern tough guy. Monkeys don't care, they just get the job done, so they just bounce around and whatever it takes to get the job done. And if he throws some sand at you, jumps at you, and uses his feet while he's hanging onto a tree, so be it, while he ducks and rolls around. So they're very evasive in their style, and I thought I explained that quite well, where if you grab his wrist, then he just falls through that and his elbow comes at you and all that sort of stuff. So the monkey style is fantastic. It's great fun. And then he met his ancestor. They walked together. Bodhidharma. Look at that. So he met him. They went to Kumicho's castle, grabbed the sword. He just took it, threw it at Steve's feet. Fantastic. And Bodhidharma ran towards the lion spirit and joined it. And then Steve did the same. He was inside it. He was welcomed. He was welcomed into the lion spirit, which is the embodiment of his rage, I guess. But it's more than that, isn't it? It seems to be his entire bloodline is somehow trapped. The spirit of all of his own ancestors is trapped in that spirit. So that's kind of a bit unique, and it's it shows he's pretty much a favoured offspring, if we like. So that's pretty cool. By the time we got to the end of the chapter, he's been exposed to all 5. So we've got 4 very martial arts style, the Lohan, or 18 hands Arhat. We've got White Crane, we've got the Monkey, we've got the Grand Emperor, Tai Tzu, which is the 4 very external martial arts. And then you've got the 1 internal, which is Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma are all the internal exercises and the Qigong, the breathing and trying to generate your power, for your energy, your life force, and focusing on that. So this is where the 5 ancestors come from. And I think our Steve is going to get some instruction in that, perhaps further instruction in that. The girl was kind of interesting because, you know, she's young and she's got no afflictions, no demonic afflictions. I think that's probably a prerequisite, isn't it, to get into the spiritual sanctuary. Si Ming, he's a god. He's got no demonic afflictions. He's there. What I mentioned earlier about the 3 Deathbringers. So, you know, one of those 3, think about it, one of those 3 things is going to kill you. Something in your head goes wrong, you're dead. Something in your heart goes wrong, you're dead. Something down further below goes wrong, you're dead. So something's going to get us sooner or later. And he reads them. So he'll know precisely how you're going to die and when. So he's in a bit of a unique situation. Hence why the Chinese believe in it. Many Chinese believe in it, not all of them. Many. So an interesting chapter. We really got immersed in the Kung Fu here, in Shaolin Kung Fu. And we met our dear little Piglet. I think, well, we've named him Pig. And I think, Steve sort of thinks it's cute. He thought he was going to eat it to begin with, but then he had to carry it whilst he was meditating. You're holding this little pig like that. It's rested over your arms or something. So that's, it'll get tiring. Even if holding your hands out like that for a while will get tiring. Believe me, I've done it to my students. So it's all good fun, just to keep them tuned in. So that was the end of the chapter, my friends. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed getting transported into another world. What I suggest you do is, if you're half interested in any of that, look up the Wu Yi Mountains. Look up where they are geographically. And look up some of the, perhaps some search queries. Immortal Wu Yi Mountains. T Wu Yi Mountains. That's W-U-Y-I. And you'll start seeing some very interesting bits of information. Look up Si Ming. He's great value. S-I-M-I-N-G. Maybe there's no dash sometimes. Si Ming. So there's a lot of stuff to look up. If you're interested, it's good fun. In any case, I'll be back soon with the next chapter. It's going to be fun, of course. As we know, it's getting to the serious end of the book. There's not much to go, so please hang in there, and I really appreciate you if you've been hanging around right from the beginning. So thank you very much. We'll see you very shortly. Tell people about it. Hopefully convince them to buy a book. It's always appreciated. Thank you again. See you soon.